I've been doing a lot of research recently on whether prescribed burning is good or bad for the California chaparral. And today was one of those days where, as you learn more about something, it really just opens your eyes up to how little you knew before. For example, when I thought of prescribed burning in California, I thought this is the answer to the wildfire problem. It's a way to clear out fuels so then you don't get a massive wildfire in the future. It also returns California to a more natural ecosystem because we used to have wildfires that would just be able to burn before humans came here. And a lot of our plants and animals have actually adapted to this. And then if you engage in too much fire suppression, the fuels just build up over time and then you get a massive wildfire, which is not only bad for the plants and animals, but it's also dangerous for humans and ends up leading to huge losses in terms of property. So I figured prescribed burning, always good, clears out fuels, mimics nature. What could be wrong with it? But as I did more research today, I realized it's a lot more nuanced than I originally thought. So when I'm talking about this, I want to make the distinction that I'm mostly going to be talking about the California chaparral and not so much grasslands or forest. Up in forest, I do still believe that prescribed burning is one of the big answers up there. It seems like after a century of fire suppression, we do have too many fuels up there, which actually isn't even completely healthy for the fuels up there because you end up having 100 trees in, let's say, an acre of land sharing water that maybe should just be sustaining 20 trees. So then they're all weakened and then they're more susceptible to different diseases. But then it's also not good to completely suppress fire because then you end up building up a lot more grassland and brush that wouldn't normally be there. So just an example there is giant sequoias, one of the coolest plants in the world, has lots of natural defenses to wildfire. It has fire-resistant bark. It also engages in something called self-pruning, where its lower branches purposely fall off so that if a fire comes through the ground, it doesn't catch the tree on fire. And then its seeds, or seedlings, or I think it's seeds, or cones, I don't know. They only open up after a wildfire has come through because that's when a lot of the competition has been cleared out and it's a good time for that new growth of a giant sequoia to happen. So has all these natural defenses to survive wildfire, but what can happen with fire suppression is you end up building up a lot more fuels and then when a fire comes through it's burned so hot and unnaturally hot that it ends up overwhelming these defenses and the giant sequoia is destroyed. So that still seems like prescribed burning would be a good idea up there. You can have lower intensity burns maybe in the part of the season that's not as warm to help protect some of the giant sequoias and actually return the ecosystem to maybe what it should be without any fire suppression. But in the chaparral, it seems like things are a bit more nuanced. So within this, the argument for or against prescribed burning, I think could also be further broken down between what's good for humans and then also what's good for the chaparral. So good for the plants and the animals that live there. So we'll just look at what's good for humans first. The obvious point of prescribed burning that would be good for humans is it clears out a lot of fuels. So then if a wildfire happens during a hotter, drier part of the year, the fuels aren't there to have it turn into an extreme wildfire and take out a bunch of homes, potentially threaten lives, and obviously it would make the job a lot harder for firefighters. And then in addition to that, it allows people to live in these beautiful landscapes where you could still have some chaparral there, but then you could use prescribed burning as maybe a little buffer between the dense chaparral and where you might have a home. If you use prescribed burning to clear out some of the old growth that burns a lot more intensely, then you get more new growth, and that could be a lot more manageable during a wildfire. So it could almost be used as a protective barrier. But someone who would say that prescribed burning is actually bad for humans, well, the first one that comes to mind for me would be someone would say, well, you're putting fire on the ground. That's dangerous. It could potentially get out of control. Although that one might be kind of a weak argument because I read somewhere that only 1% of prescribed fires actually do go out of control. And they have whole teams that look at the weather conditions, the fuel moisture to make sure that they're doing it at the right time and it's going to be safe. But then they would also say that it's also not good for humans if you have fire because then it's going to lead to more smoke. Although that argument also isn't the best one because a paper actually just came out this last week that says if you do more prescribed fires, it ends up leading to less intense fires. So you do get some smoke, but overall you end up getting less smoke in the long run because you don't end up having those gigantic fires that kick up smoke that starts in California and then maybe goes all the way to New York. But another reason that someone against prescribed fires would say for why it's good for humans not to have prescribed fires is they would say, well, the chaparral just has intrinsic value in itself. And humans get to go into this amazing environment and they can maybe walk along a trail that's there and enjoy some of the scenery. And it's just a part of California. So it's interesting to be able to kind of be a part of that nature. So, few arguments for and against, and that's with regards to whether it's good or bad for humans. Then I think it gets a little trickier when you're talking about whether it's good or bad for the chaparral itself, whether for the plants and animals. In the past, what I always thought was, well, prescribed fire is great for the chaparral because it's evolved to live with fire. A lot of the chaparral plants, even if it looks like they've been completely burned out, I actually remembered one more for humans. People would also say that prescribed fires are bad for humans because it would clear out some of the chaparral, and then if a rainstorm comes, it would be more susceptible to flooding. So that's a pretty good argument right there. But back to the animals and plants one. People who are saying that we should do prescribed burning would say that we should do it because, well, the chaparral is naturally adapted to fire, and it actually requires fire to kind of promote new growth. And how this works is there's stages of chaparral. You have the new growth, and then some animals are adapted to that, and then up to the old growth, which is maybe more than 2 or 3 decades old, and that actually has less biodiversity. But there's still some value to that kind of environment. So if you have a prescribed burn, you'd be able to clear out some of that old growth and open it up to new growth. And the plants that are naturally adapted to this, you'd think that after a fire they'd be completely killed, but a lot of chaparral shrubs have what's called a burl, and it's underneath the soil, and it's a store of lots of nutrients and some water, so that after the fire comes through, the plant is ready, and then it pops up some new sprouts, and you get the new growth. So it's not actually killed, it's evolved for a fire to happen. And you could say that this is one good thing about prescribed burning is you could clear out invasive species that aren't adapted like this, and then the chaparral would come back and it would promote more native vegetation, which is also good for native animals. But something that kind of goes against this, so the people who say don't do prescribed burning, is I'd say 2 reasons. One, they say most prescribed burns happen in the spring, whereas the natural kind of fire time for the chaparral is during the hot, dry summer. So a lot of these plants and animals have evolved for summer fire, not spring fire. So the spring fire, and the reason most prescribed fires happen in spring, I don't know if I said this, it's because if you do it in summer, there is a lot better chance that it's going to get out of control. It's a lot hotter and drier there. So you want to do it earlier in the year. But some people say, no, to do it earlier in the year is actually bad for the environment. It's bad for the soil, it's bad for the seeds, it's bad for the plants that have been investing in their reproductive systems throughout the spring. It's bad for animals that are reproducing around this time as well. So they say the timing of this is bad. And then they also say that the return interval of the fire is most likely too early. And this is where a big part of the debate comes in, the return interval. Because some people would say, with all the fire suppression we've had, there's been too long since a fire has gone through an area, and we need to put fire on the ground to kind of mimic the more natural process. But then there's the other side that says, no, in the California chaparral, maybe that might be true up in the Sierra, where you have lightning that could start a lot of fires. But in the chaparral, it's usually along the California coast, where lightning is exceptionally rare. So there might not have been fires for 100 years in some parts of the chaparral as it was evolving over centuries. So its return interval could be as long as 150 years. And then with humans moving into California, starting a lot more fires, and then on top of that doing prescribed fires, it shortens this return interval of the fires much shorter than it should be. And they say that what I was talking about with how the plants have a burrow that's underneath the soil, it's like their little reserve system. They say if you shorten that return interval too much, then it doesn't have the ability to kind of store up enough nutrients. It would want to do that over decades, but if you keep doing a return interval too much, it doesn't have enough nutrients, and then it's not going to resprout, and it would be bad. So lots of different arguments here. I think a big part of it, though, is just the debate between management or letting nature be on its own. One argument for just letting nature be on its own, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's an interesting example, is one thing I heard is that after a fire happens in the chaparral, what we'll do a lot of the time is go over it with an aircraft and drop seeds onto it. And it's seeds of usually some type of Italian grass that grows very quickly, and that if it's Italian grass, it must not be native to California. But the kind of theory here is that the Italian grass would bring some roots down into the soil, and then that would protect any communities underneath that hillside from a mudslide during the next season, because it's usually the roots that hold the hillside in place. But this is one of those examples where it sounds like a good solution, but it's actually not, because what ends up happening is this Italian grass isn't meant for this environment. It's meant for continuous rainfall for it to grow. And anybody who lives in California knows that we don't really get continuous rainfall. We get spurts of rainfall where you have a ton one week and then nothing for 2 weeks and then a ton the next week. We have atmospheric river events. So the grass doesn't even grow that well. And then it can also crowd out space for the natural chaparral seedlings that are trying to pop up after the fire. And then on top of that, it would also promote more fire the next season. And then if a fire happens in this grassland, it would then kill all the new baby chaparral plants that are trying to pop up and had used the burl's reserves to try to grow, and then they get wiped out. And then it just transitions to a non-native hillside, which maybe has this Italian grass on it, which actually doesn't hold the hillside place in as well as a chaparral ecosystem, which has extremely long roots that holds the hillside in place incredibly well. So the original goal of putting the Italian grass seeds on the hillside is to reduce mudslides and erosion, but it ends up being completely counterproductive. And that was a bit of a long tangent, but the main thing I was trying to get across there is that a lot of our solutions or interventions actually end up backfiring, and the natural ecosystem may just be better if we just allowed it to be a natural ecosystem and let it just do its own thing, because it certainly survived fine without us before we came here. Now, the argument against that would be, well, it's no longer a natural ecosystem. Because we do fire suppression, we're already in this ecosystem, so then we have some job to mitigate some of the interventions that we've already done with more interventions. One example like this to help get that point across, because that might have been a bit wordy, is the argument of, oh, let's just let nature do its thing. Kind of falls apart when you think about if we bring over some invasive plants or invasive animals and then they start taking over the chaparral. You could probably say we'd be in the right to go in there, intervene, and try to clear out some of those maybe invasive plants or invasive animals that we've introduced. So if we've introduced maybe the wrong kind of fire interval or too much old growth because of all our fire suppression in the past, you could make the argument that we should intervene and do some prescribed fires in the present. Now I feel like I'm almost just talking in circles here, so yeah, was just trying to get out all the different things that I've been learning over the last couple days, and this definitely will not be my only video on this topic, and as I learn more, I'm sure I'll be able to communicate more effectively about this, and hopefully we'll all learn something together. Thanks for watching.